example of that where you can have an epidemic, right, a sudden outbreak in a particular area. Okay. And if it spreads to other geographical areas, you can have a pandemic, right? So, what would be a recent example of a pandemic? Yeah. So there was. So what have we been? If you're getting your flu shots, you've been immunized against this one. Which one is it? H1N1, right? That would be a pandemic. Okay. What about HIV? Is that considered a pandemic? Is it worldwide? Yeah. So we still often refer to HIV as a pandemic, right? Because if you look at the course of history, when did HIV happen? When did HIV start? Yeah. So we had the first cases of HIV in the 80s, the first documented cases. Okay. We can go back in time and probably trace it to maybe the 30s. We start to see some cases. Okay. But since then it's spread worldwide. Right. Okay, that's considered a pandemic. And we'll go back into history and mention talk about a famous pandemic that occurred in the United States and in other parts of the world called the Spanish flu. This is the 1918-1919 pandemic that killed probably closer to 40 million people worldwide. Okay? All right, so, and here you can see how pandemic is shown, right? Where now it's spread across this whole geographical area, not just located here. Any questions about that? All right, so now, here's another aspect of disease is where you can find the pathogen. Right? The medical term that we use for this is called a reservoir. Okay, this is a site where a pathogen is found. Okay? Right, so that would be the source of infection. Now, one obvious source is people. Right? So that would be a human reservoir. And we'll see in different diseases you can have human reservoirs that are symptomatic. That is, you can tell that they have the disease. But there also can be examples where they're asymptomatic. That is, you might not be able to tell that they actually have the disease or they're a carrier of the disease. Okay? There are some sexually transmitted diseases that can act that way. If it's an animal reservoir, there's a special term that we use for a disease that resides normally in animals, but then can spread to humans. That's called a zoonosis. Right? Zoonosis, or another term that's used for this, besides zoonosis, is that it's called a zoonotic disease. Okay? Right? So the fact that we have zoo in there should give you a good clue about what that refers to. Okay? Right? These are diseases that are spread from animals to humans. Right? What would be an example of a zoonotic disease? So we have one is plague I mentioned. What's another one? Yeah, avian flu. Okay, bird flu. Right, that would be one. Okay. Right, there's actually quite a few examples. Right? Last week we learned about one. Happened in Yosemite. Yeah, hantavirus. Okay, that will be another zoonotic disease. Okay. All right. Now, to stretch this out, you can also have environmental reservoirs. So the reservoir doesn't necessarily have to be a living reservoir. It can be an environmental reservoir, so soil or water examples. So Clostridium tetani, which causes tetanus. Vibrio cholerae, which causes cholera. Okay, cholera. All right, those are examples. Okay. Let me show you a famous example which shows reservoirs, the importance of reservoirs. So keep in mind, the reason why we are interested in this not just because we want to know where the disease comes from, but if you know where the disease comes from, what can you do? What does that allow you to do? Yeah, it allows you to control the disease. Okay, right? You're gonna treat the situation differently if it's a human reservoir versus, let's say, an animal reservoir, or a human reservoir versus, let's say, an environmental reservoir, right? The measures you take will probably be different, right? Some of you may know this. There was a famous. This is before H1N1. There was a famous outbreak, or well-known or well-publicized outbreak in Hong Kong. Right? It revolved around the bird flu, and they were concerned about it spreading to become a pandemic. Right. So, if it's bird flu, the obvious reservoir is going to be birds. Okay, good. All right. So, and it turned out to be one of the major carriers was, anyone know what kind of bird? Chicken. Yes, chicken. Right. So it turned out to be chicken. So if you know that it's chicken, right? What's one way to control the disease? Yeah, you kill all the chickens, right? So they actually killed millions of chickens in Hong Kong to try to control it. All right. Right. And so in the fact that we didn't have a bird flu pandemic, right, shows that to some extent that measure works. Okay. Right. But again, once you know where the disease comes from, you can control it. All right. So here's another. This is a story in history. In microbiology history. This is a very famous example. It refers to the Broad Street cholera outbreak. This is one of the first examples of where epidemiology was being executed or being done. This was done by a physician. His name was John Snow, Dr. Snow. And what he did, so they were trying to figure out, where does cholera come from? Right? Cholera affects what part of your body? Your GI tract. Okay, so it causes massive diarrhea. We'll talk about this when we talk about gastrointestinal disease. It causes massive diarrhea, and people often die from this. Right? So how is it that you die from this? What's going on? Yeah, dehydration. Right? You lose so much fluid that your body just fails. Okay. So the question is, where does this disease come from? And so what John Snow did was document where all the cases of cholera were occurring during that period of time when there was that outbreak. And so that's what these black bars represent. Okay? Right? So he counted the number of cases in this area of London. This was in London. And if you look at this map and look at the cases, where does the cases seem to be focused? Where do they come from? In the center, right? They seem to come from the center, right? Broad Street. That's where you get Broad Street from. Broad Street cholera outbreak. Okay? Does anybody know what feature of Broad Street is responsible? Okay, water. That's good. Okay. Where does everything point to? Take in mind Broad Street, water. Some of you may actually see this. Where is it pointing to? What's in the center here?
The pump.
A water pump. Yeah. So it turned out to be that this was actually the source of the outbreak. It was a contaminated water pump. Okay. All right. But the reason why they can figure this out was because of this epidemiological data, right, which pointed like an arrow to where the source was, which was the pump. Okay. So what London officials did was simply remove the handle to the pump, right? And then over time, what happened to be cholera cases? Yeah, it went down, right? It went away. Okay. All right. So that turned out to be the right call. Again, that's why knowledge of a reservoir can be helpful. Any questions about this? Okay. If that kind of stuff interests you, you want to learn more about the history of that. There's a book that came out called The Ghost Map. by Stephen Johnson, who's not a microbiologist, by the way. He's a science writer, but he wrote a good book about this. Okay. All right. And if you look online, like in Google, you can probably find some talks he gave about this book. Any questions about this? Okay, so now, again, we're trying to get you into the terminology so that you have a better understanding of what happens with the specific diseases that we talk about. And keep in mind that whenever we encounter a new disease, and that's going to happen, right? The diseases that you're going to be facing in your profession, right, they could be different than the ones that we're contending with right now. Okay? But the concepts of how we understand the disease are going to be the same, right? So we're going to be thinking about what's the reservoir, right? How they're spread. Is it communicable or not communicable? Okay, so all those issues are going to come into play. And another aspect of the disease that we always look to is how is a disease transmitted? Right? What's the vehicle of transmission? What that refers to is what kind of medium is responsible for spreading the disease. And we can usually divide it into three. It could be either water, okay, it could be food, it could be air. All right, so just going over some of the examples we've gone through. Think about influenza. How is that spread? They're usually air. It's airborne. Okay, right? What about cholera? Water. All right. Okay. Right. And then we'll learn about different examples of, let's say, food poisoning. Right. That's going to be foodborne. Okay. So waterborne transmission refers to, so what that's going to ultimately refer to is that it's spread by oral fecal route, okay, through contaminated water. So think back to last week when we looked at some of the protozoa. All right, some of those were spread by an oral fecal route. Okay, right, so you may drink contaminated water, you get giardia. Okay, so that would be waterborne transmission. Airborne transmission, okay, so influenza would be an example of that. This is actually the most common route of transmission. And then there's foodborne transmission. It usually results from not preparing food properly. Right? So food poisoning, tapeworms, those are examples that we'll come across. Okay? Any questions about this? Also, how we come in contact. How we come in contact with an infectious agent, right? Plays a part in its transmission. So it can either be by direct contact, so you have to have direct physical contact, right? So STDs fall in this category, obviously. Okay. You get indirect contact. Now we're going to look at a specific example of indirect contact. That's called fomites. Right? Fomites are so this is another medical term that's used. These are non-living objects that can harbor and transmit pathogens. Okay? So this lab table right here, can be a fomite. Right? Because there could be a pathogen here that could get transmitted to you. Right? In a healthcare setting, bedding can be a fomite. Surgical instruments not properly sterilized can be a fomite. Lab tables, bottles. Okay. Again, these are all non-living objects that can transmit a pathogen. Right? Now there are studies that show that your smartphone or your cell phone can be a fomite. Right? Probably pathogens right now on your cell phone. We all have pathogens, and now they're on your cell phone. Okay, right? And there are cases where you can spread colds that way. Right? Phones. Okay. And then just another route of transmission is often mentioned is droplet